On the Behind the Drive channel, I like to poll my audience on my community page to get a general opinion on different topics in Formula 1. And over the last month, they've got quite a few votes, which means we can see a general view of the F1 community in terms of the results of these polls. So I thought I'd take a look at the results of the 3 most interesting polls from February and see what you think about these questions. Let's have a look. My name's Andy, and this is Behind the Drive. Will Lance Stroll and Sebastian Vettel make contact during races in 2021? First up is the poll that actually received the most votes at the time of recording, and it was a pretty one-sided one as well. I asked whether you thought that Stroll and Vettel would make contact in races during the 2021 season, and there was an overwhelming vote to say that they will, after 3,695 votes. I actually put this one as one of my out there predictions in my 2021 predictions video. I was actually quite surprised that 84% of people think that it's quite likely for the coming season. It makes sense. Stroll's still making some errors, for example hitting Norris at the Portuguese Grand Prix last year after making a very similar error just a couple of days before hitting Max Verstappen during free practice. Then of course you have Sebastian Vettel, who during the back end of his Ferrari career started making more and more errors. For example, his spin at Silverstone last year on the first lap, which dropped into the back of the order and ruined his race. And other notable mistakes include Baku back in 2017 where he hit Hamilton's car, which was hardly a mistake as it was a deliberate action. But then you also have his retirement in Germany in 2018, where he failed to capitalise on an opportunity to take a commanding lead in the championship. And then to top these all off, you have the glaringly obvious incident with regard to Stroll and Vettel, which was back in Monza in 2019, where Vettel had spun at the Ascari chicane and then hit Stroll as he recovered back onto the track. So these two have a history, and it seems like the majority of people who answered this poll at least think it could happen again. The other interesting point on this one is that to hit each other, they need to be on a similar point to the track. So it seems like the majority of people think that they could be quite evenly matched for 2021. I think they could be, but there's also a number of unknowns with these two. For example, could Stroll reach the levels that he achieved during the first half of 2020? And can Vettel find the form that he had between 2010 and 2013 as he moves into this new team environment? I'm sure he'll want to quickly become the de facto number 1 driver at the team, so if they do end up close on track, well who knows what could happen. As for what you guys said in the comments, Howard Wright reckons it will happen 2 or 3 times as both drivers will want to take that lead driver role. And it'll be interesting to see if Stroll's in a position to take that lead driver role. In his 4 seasons in the sport so far, he's been the number 2 on 3 occasions, and when he was the de facto number 1 driver ahead of Sergei Sirotkin in 2018, he didn't exactly perform to the level of a number 1 driver. So it's an interesting point, and I would say that even though he's in his 5th season in Formula 1, Stroll is still learning, and I think it would be a sensible move for the Canadian to learn as much as he can from the 4-time world champion. Who has the best driver lineup for 2021? Next up, it's a divisive one, and it was which team has the best driver lineup for 2021. And this poll has 2,744 votes at the time of recording. I gave 5 options to choose from, and I put the top 4 teams that I had in my video on the topic, which were Mercedes, Red Bull, Ferrari and McLaren, plus I added the choice of other. The winners here were Red Bull, which took 44% of the vote, or 1,207 people. And although I don't agree that they have the best driver lineup, it's definitely up there with Verstappen and Perez for 2021. I think that if Perez can get up to speed in that car and do better than Albon and Gasly have done in the past couple of years, they could really become a thorn in the side of that Mercedes team. But I think it's second place in this poll that makes it the most interesting, as McLaren took second with their new driver lineup of Daniel Ricciardo and Lando Norris, taking 34% of the vote. Or in other words, 933 people thinking that the new driver pairing was the best for 2021. Now this result is quite likely to have been skewed by the fact that I just posted a video on the McLaren team a couple of days before, which could have meant a few more McLaren fans were looking at my channel at the time. But for me, I think that while the driver pairing is definitely one of the best on the grid, Norris is still just in his 3rd season in Formula 1 right now, and while he's improving year on year, it's difficult to put him in the best pairing. You could also say that some people have seen the question as being the best driver lineup for the memes, which if that's the case, then it's difficult not to agree. Another interesting part of this poll was that my top driver lineup for 2021 in Ferrari had just 11% of the vote, with their lineup of Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz for 2021. And I still think they're the best lineup. The performances from both of these guys last year was incredible, particularly from Leclerc, as he managed to drag that woeful Ferrari car into places it just didn't belong. As for Sainz, well he really delivered during his time at McLaren, and I reckon he could really offer a lot in that Ferrari seat with the experience he's had in Formula 1 so far. He's still got a lot to prove already with his seat under threat, and I think that he's going to be out there to prove himself once again. As for the comments in this one, well, there were a few interesting approaches to work out the top driver lineups. Frederick Kaufmann gave each individual driver a rating, which in his opinion put Red Bull out of the front, with Mercedes and Ferrari tied for a close second. I think that this approach is an interesting one to see the different driver ratings up and down the grid, so maybe it's something I'll have a look at in the future. Just before I get into the next poll though, I wanted to take a moment to ask you to consider subscribing to Behind the Drive. I've got loads more content just like this to come, and it massively supports the channel. Thanks. Are sprint races a good idea for Formula 1? So next up was a question that I posted as I was interested to see what F1 fans' opinions would be on a topic that was hot news in the F1 world at the time. And that was whether sprint races are a good idea to happen on a Saturday. Now the reason this one was interesting was just how close the split was. It sat on 50-50 for a long time and settled after 2,822 votes on 48% in favour and 52% not in favour. So the no's have it. And it's an interesting one as the sport is proposing these ideas in order to increase the amount of racing and excitement over the course of a race weekend. It may happen at a handful of races this year, but it isn't yet confirmed. And there are a couple of different points of view that I think explains the divided nature of this poll. For starters, we have Stig Guay, and I'm sorry if I pronounce your name wrong there, who says that F1 should be trying new ideas and is therefore presumably in favour of trying out the sprint races. And from this point of view, I couldn't really agree more. I think that testing these ideas at a couple of races this year could be a really good way to see whether it works for Formula 1. And, as we saw from elimination qualifying back in 2016, it's very easy to reverse decisions if it emerges that the new setup just doesn't work. A sprint race might not be the eventual answer to more competitive racing and more excitement over the course of the weekend, but it's worth a shot even if it only happens a couple of times. And there were a lot of people with this opinion of seeing how it goes. On the other hand, you have people who aren't in favour of sprint races, and you could argue that these purists of the sport don't want to see change to the race weekend's format. But some people argue that the cost of running sprint races would also be too high. And there are a few of you in the comments that mentioned this, like Arthur Bretas, who thinks that the sprint races wouldn't work as the cost would be too much for the smaller teams. And that's something that needs to be considered. The teams have a new cost cap in terms of car development for 2021, and the sport is trying its utmost to reduce the cost. However, some teams don't have the budget to reach the cap itself, so if they need to spend additional money on the sprint races, be that additional time they'd need to prepare the car for the race, or even just the additional risk of having the cars out racing on track, the teams would need to be rewarded for this with championship points. But then as soon as you're offering additional championship points on a Saturday, you could start to devalue the main event of a Sunday race. So you can see why there's apprehension given the details of how the sprint races would look hasn't been widely shared. I think Matej sums it up well in the comments, as he says the only way to find out is to sacrifice a week and see how it goes. And this is exactly right. In order for the sport to move forward, a few things need to be tried and tested. It's the only way to make progress. Plus, if sprint races are a way to bring in a new swathe of fans to the sport, then I'm all for it. The sprint race in Formula 2 is often one of the most exciting events of the weekend, with some varying strategies and different drivers often ending up at the front. It's one of the reasons that F2 is seen as a proving ground for the young drivers. But F2 is a spec series, with lower downforce cars that make it easier to overtake. So perhaps Formula 1 needs to wait till the 2022 regulation cars, which is one of the risks of running the events on occasions this year, rather than waiting till the new regs. And if Ross Brawn and the FOM achieve what they set out to do, which is allowing the cars to compete closer together, maybe a sprint race could be really exciting. But I worry that the current 2021 cars could struggle to create a competitive sprint race. Overall, I think it should be tried, but at the same time, I understand exactly why this poll was so close on this occasion. If you want me to do a full video on the topic of sprint races once there's more information available, then let me know in the comments, as I think is a really interesting idea for Formula 1, and that way I could offer my full opinion. So that was my top 3 polls from February, summarising the thoughts of you, the F1 community. It's a bit of a different style video for me this week, so let me know if you would like to see this style of video again in the future for the polls that I run in March, and any feedback on how I can make these videos better is definitely welcome. And as always, if you've enjoyed this video then please leave it a like and subscribe for more F1 content for 2021 and beyond.